Good afternoon and welcome to our video response series to the Post-Pandemic Future of Homeschooling Conference that is hosted by the Harvard Kennedy School. If you have not seen the first 3 videos in this series, you can find them on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. You can search for both under the name HomeschoolFreedom. And there are still 3 weeks and 3 more topics remaining to be covered during this webinar series. So also be sure to hit subscribe so that you don't miss our future videos. My name is Sheri Payne, and I'm the Director of Leadership and Military Support for the Home Educators Association of Virginia. I homeschooled my 3 children for 22 years and have taught history and government online and in homeschool co-ops. Joining me today are Rebecca Kocsis, General Manager and Support Network Director for Christian Home Educators Association of California. And we round out our panel with Jennifer Snyder, who has been co-president of Homeschool New York for 2 years after serving on the board since 2014. Welcome, ladies.
Hi. Hi, Sheri. Thanks for having us.
And we're here today to have a roundtable discussion in response to week 4 of the Harvard event. And today's topic at the event was, are homeschoolers socially isolated? So before we offer any specific commentary on the session that we just watched, I want to start by letting each of our panelists introduce themselves, their work within the homeschool community, and how they've been able to interact with, observe, and evaluate homeschooled children. Rebecca?
Hi, thanks, Sheri. So like you, I homeschooled our children for 22 years. All 5 of our children graduated from our homeschool. In the process of our home education journey, I ran a homeschool program. In California, we call it a private school satellite program for 15 years, working directly with parents and children. And then years after that, in the subsequent years, I've worked primarily working with homeschool group leaders that are a part of our network here in the state of California, just staying in touch with their, keeping my fingers on the pulse of what's happening within the individual homeschool communities across this great big state. And then also, heading up this organization and talking more policy related issues most recently.
Thank you, Rebecca. And Jennifer.
So we are wrapping up our 17th year homeschooling. And I have 2 adult sons who have finished, high school, college. One is married. And we started homeschooling them when they were 10 and 8. So we didn't get to do it from the beginning with them. But then I ended up having 2 more girls who are now 16 and 13. So we're still in homeschooling and with our sights set on doing it for a while longer. And it was interesting because our introduction to homeschooling, as far as interacting with other homeschoolers, was in a very small community, a support group of other families, maybe a dozen or so families. We got together for activities and field trips and to compare curriculum and talk about what worked and didn't work. But then, like you mentioned, in 2014, my husband and I joined the board of Homeschool New York. And so that was our first exposure to the statewide and then ultimately nationwide connection of homeschool leaders and seeing the movement and the history and understanding all of what went into making homeschooling legal, and just seeing that in every state, across every barrier or whatever, there were homeschoolers who really just were well invested in their children and trying to do the best and really succeeding at what they did. And so that's been really impressive for me, because I feel like that's 2 different perspectives on homeschooling that I've had.
Nice, thank you. And for myself personally, it's funny how I've been interacting with the homeschool community for many, many years. I was actually newly married, and my husband and I had conversations about how we would educate our children. And at the time, homeschooling for us was considered to be something that only really crazy people did, and we would never, that would never be a choice for us. And then they asked us to join a church plant in our town, and we decided to go with them. And then after we committed, found out that they all homeschooled. Wow. And I remember my husband and I saying, have we joined a cult? But the amazing thing is what a great exposure to a homeschool community, right? And we, after getting to know these people, we both said to each other, this is what we want our children to be like. Mm-hmm. And that started it. And we didn't even have kids yet. And so we've had quite a long journey in that whole process of being involved in homeschool communities. And we've been in support groups and all kinds of different co-ops, and we've interacted with people from, and being military, it's been all over the country, from here in Virginia to Connecticut to California to Hawaii, and now back to Virginia. And so we've seen homeschoolers in all different formats and all different cultures and communities, and it's been really amazing. And also being in leadership for many years of support groups and co-ops, I've been counseling and evaluating homeschool students for many years, and I've been working now for 4 years with the Home Educators Association of Virginia in counseling homeschoolers from all different walks of life. And so that's my experience for that. And so so this is kind of fun to have this opportunity to discuss what the panelists today were talking about in this seminar. And remember that the question that they asked today was, are homeschool children socially isolated? So did they answer the proposed question? Jennifer?
So I think it was a resounding no. Homeschoolers are not socially isolated. And it was nice to see that they had data and that drew from different studies and different groups and different ways of obtaining that information. And they looked at it across, different, what socialization means. And so that particularly stood out to me, because I know that tends to be one of the top questions that homeschoolers are asked when you're telling somebody that you're homeschooling is, well, do you worry about socialization? And so I've come to realize that when we talk about socialization, and when most people talk about socialization, there's really two parts to it. And I was pleased to see that today's talk did actually address both parts. So in my mind, when I think of socialization, the words that I heard used today were being able to navigate society. Are you civically engaged? Do you understand how to interact with the world around you? And I think, again, we saw that they compared side by side homeschool students with public school students, with private school students. The democratic values are there. The voter registration is there. The voting is there. And so, yes, we are civically engaged. The homeschoolers profess higher levels of thankfulness and satisfaction with life. They don't, they're not divorced on any higher level. So that type of, interaction with others in their life seems to be not affected by the fact that they were homeschooled. And so I was glad to see that, because I think a lot of times when people ask that question, what they really mean is socializing. And so those are, in my mind, two different things. And I was glad to see today that it did actually address both. We want our children to grow up to be good citizens and to be able to function and be successful in life. And so this showed that, yes, we're able to do that. But the flip side of it, the socializing, we do that well too. We are out and about more. We visited the historical societies and the museums more. That was all data that was put up there, even on a lower income, which was shown to, be more typical, that we find ways to do these things. We form co-ops. Whether it's on a grand scale formally with large groups of families or just a couple of groups of families, our kids are out there getting together with other kids. And so we're doing both well.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I believe that to answer your question, basically, Sheri, yes, they answered the question. And I think if we strictly looked at the data, we'd say no, homeschool students are not socially isolated. As David Sickink said, he said they're hardly staying within the four walls of their home. As you said, they're out and about in the community even. And here's an interesting point that the data showed was that, contrary to what most people think, you have to be rich to homeschool. Homeschoolers' annual income tends to be lower than the median. So it tends to be a little bit lower, but they did acknowledge that the reason for that is because there's generally only one income in the family. So I think it says volumes about a parent's intentionality in finding academic opportunities as well as social opportunities for their student outside of their home, based regardless of whether they have a lot of money or where they have a little bit of money. So I thought that was very, very interesting that they pointed that out. But yes, hardly homeschoolers are socially isolated. I started homeschooling in the 1980s, and this was one of the biggest questions I encountered in 1984. And it's ironic to me that in 2021, this is still the number one question, is what about socialization? And the flip side, or maybe we should say, what about negative socialization? Many parents homeschool because they want positive peer influence for their students that they're not receiving in a traditional educational environment. But what I found over the years is that it's still a question. I am surprised by it even more as time goes on, because let's look at the logic of it. What makes you think that students only encounter other human beings in the four walls of their classroom or on the campus of their school? Why would you think, and bullying is a big question. People ask me, well, how are they going to learn how to deal with bullies? The question is, are they socially isolated and thus not being able to, being deprived so that they can't encounter and deal with real life as adults? So what about bullies? They have to go to public school to deal with bullies. That's an incorrect assumption. How many of you have a bully on your block or in your neighborhood? Another one is, how do they deal with the mean girls? Well, are there only mean girls in junior high? I think we encounter them in our neighborhood. We encounter them, in our junior high youth groups. We encounter them in the soccer league. So it just does not make sense that you would think that this is the only place that children learn how to deal with hardship. And in actuality, children that are home educated do not escape from real life into a contrived educational environment for 6 to 7 hours a day. They're home, so they may be dealing and even going with mom to take grandma to her chemotherapy appointments. They'll be dealing with the deaths in the family. And let's talk about sibling rivalry within your four walls.
That's right.
So the whole concept of children who are home educated do not have to deal with adversity, it just does not make sense. It's illogical to me. So I'm thankful that academia is addressing this. I'm thankful that the data is bearing out what we've been saying for decades, is that home educated students are not socially isolated and they are properly being prepared for life. Will there be gaps in some of their education? Absolutely. I went to a very affluent public high school in Southern California. And I can tell you, as I started teaching my children at home, there were gaps in my education. So so I'm thankful that the data is bearing with what we've been saying for all these years.
Yeah, I would have to agree with both of you. They definitely did answer the question with a resounding no. The really funny thing is I was quite surprised by that. I really felt that they would at least have one of them who would be on the other side. And it quite surprised me. And one of the reasons I really feel that way is because socialization is such an interesting term. It can be defined in so many different ways because it has a lot to do with values. And people's values are so different, right? So if you're coming from a situation where you feel that society's values are such that you don't believe in parental rights, private education, you would answer that question very, very differently. And we didn't see that. And I was really surprised by that. I was really thinking that we would have to do that. And I was ready to define, that most of us as homeschoolers have a very unique perspective on things like the rights of parents and on what education is. And we didn't see that, but I know it exists out there, and that's important to point out because we do know that there are people who would define. society and socialization very, very differently. And so would come up with a much different answer. Absolutely. Another thing that I wanted to point out that I thought was really important is the samples that were given by the two panelists in all their studies were, if you think about the population of the United States, they were actually very statistically small sample sizes. And so we don't know, I mean, a small sample size usually tends to point to what a large sample size would say, but it is not a guarantee. So we really don't know until there are more larger, broader studies how that would play out.
Yeah, interestingly, Sheri, I think that a lot of the studies on homeschooling have been pulled from broader studies that were intended for different purposes, but they just happened to learn about home educators in the process of it. So yes, I think that, you know, and that would bear with why there's a relatively small sample size.
Yeah. There needs to be more studies done. And that was funny, is because that was true of last week as well. The subject that we were talking about last week, same thing. Okay, and then the other thing about these studies that was interesting and I think needs to be studied further, and I believe it was Daniel Hamlin who pointed out the episodic nature of homeschooling in these studies. And like the one study had a sampling where 47% of the students identified as homeschooling actually were only homeschooled for 1 or 2 years. And that's, you know, when you think about it, that's going to influence the answer to this question. Are homeschoolers socially isolated? Because there's a big difference between being homeschooled for 1 year and being homeschooled for 12 years. And so that's got to factor into any studies that we do on this. But coming back to the fact that there was so much positivity in all the studies that
Sheri, can I interrupt you for just a second?
No,
I'm sorry. So it just occurred to me, I mean, we know that that's important, looking at how long a student has been home educated. And we know that the longer a student is home educated, the benefits of homeschooling really start to bear out. In California, we're embarking on some research that specifically includes that in our surveys. You know, are you home educated? You know, is your student home educated? Are they home educated, number one, apart from the public school system? Because we're looking for those that are homeschooling apart from government support or intervention. And also, how long has this student been educated at home? Because we do feel that that's extremely important to know. You know, and as you had said earlier, Jen, you know, why were they only homeschooled for such a short period of time? You know, those things make a big difference in the outcome of the research.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's so many factors that have to be, to really answer that question fully, there's so many factors that have to be considered in a study of that nature. Exactly. So
you have to define homeschooling, and even that doesn't even have a standard across 50 states. So, you know, it is going to be tough to get hard numbers that you can just say this is true of everybody.
Yeah, I think for research sake, you have to define homeschooling for your subjects. And for our purposes, this is what homeschooling is. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to derail you.
No, that's exactly, you know, you're exactly right. And that actually points something out very important, that exactly what you said. It goes along with what Jennifer said, because we have 50 states that have 50 different laws on homeschooling in their state. And your state, Rebecca, has charter school homeschooling, which is supported by and regulated by the government. And then it has free homeschooling, where you declare yourself as a private school and you have complete freedom to homeschool. So it's like, what kind of homeschooling are you talking about? Right. And Jennifer, your state highly regulates homeschooling of any kind. So it's very, very different. And so that has to be factored into any study that you do, because the nature of how somebody homeschools is going to be different depending upon what state that they live in, as well as anything else.
And we found too that the ideological underlying reasons vary from those who homeschool through the public school as well, and those who homeschool privately. You know, in California, they do establish a private school and fall under private school statutes, and their ideological reasons for teaching their children at home tend to be different. So.
Yes, very different. And that factor is going to influence how they answer all of these questions that they provide in these studies on any subject, including socialization.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's an amazing factor. So the fact that though that we have so many, all three, both the panelists and the commentator, all had a lot of positive things to say about homeschooling. How surprising is that? How surprising are those results that they have come up with in their studies?
I was not surprised. I know there are some things that you can't really, it's hard to predict. For instance, anecdotally, my experience with homeschool students, I don't walk around asking them what their SAT scores are or how they did on their standardized tests. So that you really do need, some hard research done. But anecdotally, my experience is that the data supports what the home educating community has known for decades, is that it's just it's not I want to say in our perspective as home educators, it's not a question worth asking. Obviously, for policymakers and academia, they have not been satisfied yet. We're all ready to move on, from this topic. But I'm very thankful that the data has proven what we've been saying all along. And I appreciate one of the comments that one of our commentators made was that home educated students tend to be appreciate more the democratic freedoms, which just speaks volumes to the home education, and also freedom of speech. They're much more they have more diverse relationships. They're much more accepting of people from different ethnic backgrounds, and people from different political bents, people from different religious perspectives than their own, or people who have none, and are definitely much more appreciative of the freedom of speech. So it just says a lot to me that the home education does not create students that are racist, does not create students that are they're not socially isolated, but they're much more willing to embrace people of different perspectives, and that we know benefits our society greatly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So just tagging on that last thing that Rebecca was saying, that they showed us, is that compared to the other populations of students, homeschool students tend to have more close tie relationships with people of a different race or a different culture. And I wasn't surprised by that, but it seems to be a relatively new finding to those who are studying homeschooling. The session that they had just a few weeks ago that talked about how the demographics of homeschooling was changing and how more African-American families are choosing to homeschool. So that, again, just kind of shows me something that we already knew, we're ready to move on from. But I definitely see that in my area. When you're going to public school, you're defined what school you go to by your school district, which means you live in a certain, probably socially, economically defined area. And so you're going to go to school primarily with people who fit into that demographic. But for homeschooling, in my school district, we're only one of a few families that live in this particular area. And so we connect with homeschoolers from all over in different districts and different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so I feel like we do have a more mixed friend pool, if you would, than we would if my kids were just in the local public schools. So again, that didn't surprise me, but again, research is always reinforcing it, and it's good to see. The episodic homeschooling part did surprise me a little. I mean, I know that there have been people who homeschool for a year or two, it doesn't work, or maybe whatever the reason they chose, it changed because maybe it was a particular junior high school that they didn't like. And so then they sent them to the high school because it was better. I do know that there are people that homeschool maybe just for the elementary years and then send their kids to high school because they see it as being difficult. So it didn't surprise me that there weren't as many K through 12 homeschoolers, but I was surprised to see that the majority of them were only for a year or two. Because my experience, I feel, is people do it longer for that. Honestly, if you're only doing it for a year or two, I don't think you're giving yourself enough chance to get into the groove. There's a learning curve. There's an adjustment for both parents and kids. And I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you cut yourself off too soon. But at the same time, recognizing parental rights, I think it's a good a good thing to acknowledge when, maybe this just isn't for you, and it's time to say, hey, I'm gonna do something else for my kids because I think it's better for them. And I think we should always have that freedom. And so, in that sense, episodic homeschooling doesn't worry me. But again, as a homeschool leader, I want to make sure that I'm encouraging people who maybe are feeling discouraged in those first couple of years, because I think we've all been there, and we know that sometimes you just have to kind of get over that adjustment period, and the joy and the ease comes a little bit later, possibly. And I mean, another reason could be, again, this goes back to a prior session that they did talking about barriers for homeschooling. Again, you mentioned our state, New York, is very highly regulated, and a lot of people are a little intimidated by the regulations. And so I could see a scenario, so multiple scenarios where families are just like, I can't keep doing this testing every year, or I can't keep up with the reporting, and my school district gives me a hard time over what I submit. So then maybe they would just opt to send them back to the brick and mortar school. So that, I think that maybe could explain, some of what's going on. But yeah, I was surprised that episodic, that there were the 1 to 2 years seemed to be the majority of the homeschooling time. I just thought it was interesting too, that they almost started out when they talked about the fact that homeschoolers, there weren't as many who homeschooled K through 12. And so that means they're in the brick and mortar schools, that became the reason why you couldn't say that homeschoolers were socially isolated. And so I was worried where that was going in the beginning, because I thought they were going to say, well, see, they're not socially isolated because they're in the public schools. And therefore, yeah. Right. So I wanted to make sure that wasn't the reason that they say, well, we don't have to worry about these kids because they're not all the time at home anyway. And I think they did a good job of following up and saying, no, there are multiple other reasons why homeschoolers aren't socially isolated, even the ones that are homeschooled for K through 12. I think, as was shown by those, questioning the adults who were homeschooled and how do you look back and your experience, and it was overwhelmingly positive. So I think that was a good thing.
Yeah. Well, and speaking specifically to the episodic nature, I don't think that seeing families homeschool for 1 year or 2 years, and then doing something different is necessarily a homeschool failure. And I think specifically of anecdotally, my neighbor, who so very different from us. We're evangelical Christian. We have 5 kids. She, 3 doors down. They're Jewish. They have 2 kids. They're both they were both attorneys. I was a stay-at-home mom, and my husband's a blue-collar worker. But she would, she just really kept grilling me when I went out to pick up the mail, about homeschooling. She brought one of her children home for school because he was not thriving academically. He was a little socially awkward. And so she thought he would, do better at home. They homeschooled him for a year. And then at the end of the year, she came over to the house and said, Rebecca, thank you for helping us, coaching us through this year. She said, we're not going to keep doing it. He's going to go to a different school next year. She said, but you've opened my eyes to the fact that there is more than one way to educate a child. And she had not understood that before until she knew that what our society was offering was not working for her child. And I think that this is showing us that parents are seeing that there's more than one way to educate a child, and they're willing to homeschool while they're in the interim of moving, or they're willing to homeschool when they don't like one school until they can get to the next one. So those of us that are homeschooling for ideological reasons, are probably more the long haulers, so to speak. But I think parents are being willing to break out of the usual educational mode, and that's a good thing.
So I agree with what you said before too, Rebecca, about, we all knew this and we're ready to move on. And I was following somewhat the chat that parents were participating in. And one of the participants said something to the effect of this social isolation myth has to die. They agreed. It is time to move on. We understand this. We've always understood this. Next question, please.
Right. And I think the next question is probably going to pose a greater challenge for us as home educators.
Yeah. Absolutely. I agree. Yeah. And it's funny, Jennifer, when you were talking about, and I could see that when you have the episodic nature of homeschooling in recent years, it's because they were part of their time in a brick and mortar school of some kind. But the funny thing is, if you look at David Sickink's study, he specifically was talking about the adjustment period of kids who have never been in a brick and mortar school going to
Yes.
university level, and how while there was definitely a short period of adjustment,
Mhm.
that they actually then were more comfortable even
Yes.
than public school students. And that, isn't that funny?
Yeah.
That,
Yeah, he said the skills that they picked up as homeschoolers actually served them better, such that the adjustment period really wasn't something to be worried about. Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
And I saw that in my own kids as well.
yes.
Not one of them had ever done anything other than a co-op. They never did dual enrollment. Then never went to a school of any kind their whole lives until college, and absolutely had no problem adjusting. In fact, one of their common comments they got from their classmates was, "You were homeschooled?" Like, you do not act like a homeschooler. You don't look like a homeschooler. So there's,
Why? What does one supposed to look like?
I know. I think that frustrated my kids. Homeschoolers are not some kind of weird subset of people. We're normal people.
Yeah.
We promise you we're normal.
Yeah. Well, and I think that they made a good point. I think they did well to make a point that really all students have an adjustment period when they transition from high school to college. I mean, we've all heard about the freshman 15, and that's, just specifically health. And I think too that, socially, I think of my students' adjustment period, one in particular who came home and said she was surprised at just how few of her college classmates had intact families. Whereas in our particular homeschool group, we all had intact families. And so in that perspective, she felt that she had definitely been at an advantage. And on the other side of the coin, this is a gifted student, and she came back and she said, "Did you know that C is not a failing grade?" And it wasn't that I intended that to be a deep, dark secret, but I would not accept a C grade from her. She could master the subject and do well. And so, but that was a case where I tailored her education and her, mastery level according to her ability. I wouldn't have expected the same level of mastery from another one of the kids. So, so yeah, there's that. I just think there is that adjustment period that, your family culture is such that, there's some eye-opening experiences, but again, that's not necessarily exclusive to home educated students.
Right. Yeah, Michael Mashane even pointed out that when we asked the question, are homeschoolers socially isolated, or are they ready, or it's always compared to what? And, there are definitely public school graduates and students who would say they have a negative experience. They don't have friends, they're bullied. So it's not a guarantee, one or the other, that there's going to be a particular outcome. And so to kind of always come at it from the angle of like, well, there must be something wrong with homeschooling, we have to find out what it is. There just are problems all over, in a sense. Even you had mentioned before gaps in education. Yeah, there were gaps in my public school education too. There's going to be gaps in everybody's education because you just can't cover it all. So the idea is to teach them how to figure out later which gaps need to be made up when it's important to them. They don't get that opportunity when they're taught the same thing all the time. And so that independent learning, I think, is what comes out then when they attend college, is that they're more ready in that sense because they're more self-determined to say, hey, I don't understand this. I'm going to figure out why, instead of just saying, well, I'll just fake it till I make it, or I'm, going to get lost, or I'm going to fail this class.
Yeah,
so I think, just drop the class. Yeah, exactly. I think they just showed over and over again that at all levels, where our students are well adjusted and well ready to tackle what life has to throw at them. They're able possibly to interact with professors more because of the different varied ages and people that they interact with on a daily basis in a homeschooling family.
So we're kind of running a little bit out of time. So I'm going to ask the last question, and so we can try and answer this a little bit quickly, but I do want to get this question in because I thought this was very interesting. So Daniel Hamlin noted in his study that they were so shocked at the positivity from their first few interviewees that they felt like they had to search really hard to find what they call the subgroup that had a negative homeschooling experience socially. And, they did find a few, but not very many for their small study that they did. And it kind of made that an interesting thought for me so that brings up a couple of questions. Does this subgroup then not really exist in any kind of statistical amount, or do they exist and are they hard to find and quantify because they're not engaged in society?
So we're told they exist. There are people who identify as having struggled with this. And even in the NEHA study, when they talked about the 31, there were 3 out of 31 who reported as having been socially isolated during their homeschooling time. But again, definitions, right? So what does that mean for those students? And, we had discussed among ourselves earlier, what are some reasons why somebody would say that they felt isolated from society as a homeschooler? It could be something as simple as, the family lived in the country and just didn't have an opportunity to get out that much. And so maybe they had a rich environment with books and animals and land and outdoors experiences, but they didn't have a lot of interaction with people outside the family. I don't know that you could make a case that you have to fix that necessarily, but for that person, it might feel like a huge obstacle. A religious isolation as well, because, definitely there are homeschoolers that will teach from a certain worldview, and that's what they want their kids to understand. They may not always expose them to the information that's contrary to that, or maybe they wait until they're a little bit older when they're mature to handle it. But at the same time, we don't give parents who choose private school that's religious a hard time for picking something that aligns with their worldview. So it is generally accepted that families want to have their children educated according to their beliefs. And so there are certainly people who grow up in that atmosphere that are later going to report saying, I was isolated. I wasn't exposed to other points of view. Again, I'm not entirely convinced that that's something that needs to be fixed. So I would want to know what those 3 people felt. I'm not going to discredit that they do feel that. But again, we need to know what is isolation and why did they feel that was a problem for them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think the why has everything to do with it. And as you said, we know that there's a subgroup of people there that are unhappy with having been home educated. But I would have to say our only home educators, the community that have students that are unhappy with their education, that their parents chose for them. No, I think we have the same issue with public school students and private school students. So I don't think that this is necessarily exclusive to home education. We do need to do a better job of finding these students or these adults and find out exactly why they were unhappy, as you said, Jen. And the why has everything to do with it. So, and perhaps they're just, as you said, Sheri, are they just less engaged? Do they not want to talk about it? We really don't know. So further research needed.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Thank you both so much for being a part of today's discussion. I really appreciate it. Now, listeners, if you want to continue this conversation, we do encourage you to join our group on Facebook. It is called the HomeschoolFreedom Discussion Group. And we, the 3 of us and other leaders of state organizations, will be there to answer your questions that you have or just further this discussion. And we'd love to hear what you think. So please join us there. And we will be back next week, and we'll hope you'll join us on June 3rd as we analyze the next topic: is child abuse greater at school or in homeschool? All right. See you next week. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sheri. Thank you, Rebecca.
Good to see you, Jen. Bye-bye.